The night was one of those that seemed to stretch forever. Dark clouds covered the moon, and the rain tapped rhythmically against the window panes like impatient fingers on a desk. Sarah sat on the floor of her childhood bedroom, the warm light from her lamp casting faint shadows on the wall, flickering with each gust of wind. The old house creaked as if settling under the weight of the storm, but Sarah was used to its noises. She had grown up here after all. Next to her, Emma sat cross-legged, scrolling through her phone, pretending not to be fazed by the oppressive atmosphere. Emma had always been braver, or at least that's what she liked people to believe. But Sarah knew her best friend well enough to see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped nervously against her phone case. They had come back to Sarah's family home for the weekend, a little getaway to reminisce about old times before college would scatter them in different directions. It was supposed to be fun, but there was something about the storm, the house, and the legend of Bloody Mary that seemed to cast a dark shadow over the night. A chill ran through the room despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the small hearth. The house had always been old and drafty, but tonight it felt different, like the very walls were listening, as if the house had its own pulse, its own life. The two girls had been discussing it all evening, playing the dare game that always spiraled into something more. At first, they had laughed off the idea of doing something so silly as summoning Bloody Mary. After all, they were no longer children afraid of ghost stories. But now, with the storm raging outside, the mood had shifted. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice calm but laced with a hint of unease as she suggested that they just get it over with. Sarah didn't respond immediately, her eyes trailing to the large mirror that hung on the far wall of the room. It was old, much like the house, with a heavy wooden frame that had darkened over the years. The glass, once crystal clear, now seemed clouded with time, holding on to the countless reflections it had seen. As they stood, preparing to head into the hallway where the mirror was, Sarah felt a strange weight settle on her chest. Her grandmother used to tell her stories about mirrors. How they were doorways, portals to the other side, capable of capturing a piece of a person's soul if stared into for too long. Sarah had never truly believed in those old superstitions. They were just stories, after all, meant to keep children from lingering too long in front of their reflections. But tonight, the house seemed to whisper different truths. The bathroom mirror was covered in a fine layer of dust, and as Sarah wiped it clean with the sleeve of her sweater, a strange shiver ran up her spine. The mirror felt colder than the room itself, and for a brief second, she thought she saw movement within its depths. But when she blinked, her reflection was all that remained, her own wide eyes staring back at her, slightly distorted by the imperfections in the old glass. Emma was standing behind her now, her reflection clear and steady, but there was something strange about it. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the mirror seemed to distort them in subtle ways. The room around them looked darker, their figures sharper, more defined, like they didn't quite belong. Without waiting any longer, Emma took a step forward, positioning herself directly in front of the mirror. Sarah hesitated, her heart beat loud in her ears, but she couldn't bring herself to back out now. After all, what was there to be afraid of? It was just a story. Emma stared into her reflection, her eyes unwavering as she began the ritual. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. The words hung in the air, heavy, almost tangible. As the last syllable faded into the silence of the room, the air grew thick, suffocating. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Nothing happened at first. They stood there, side by side, their reflections motionless in the glass. For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to exhale, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. But then, as if in response to her relief, the temperature in the room plummeted. The mirror, clear just seconds before, began to fog over, as if someone had breathed on it from the other side. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows across the room. And then she saw it, just a faint outline at first, barely perceptible, but growing clearer with each passing second. A face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into her soul. The mouth was stretched into an unnatural smile, thin and blood-stained, as if it had been carved into the skin. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her body remained frozen in place. Emma was still standing beside her, but her reflection wasn't. In the mirror, Emma's reflection had not moved at all. It stood still, staring straight ahead, unblinking, while Emma herself was beginning to back away in horror. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she realized the reflection wasn't following Emma's movements. The smile in the mirror grew wider, darker. The face moved closer to the surface, as if trying to push through the glass itself. And then the figure began to whisper. Sarah couldn't make out the words at first, but the voice was low and guttural, like something not quite human. It grew louder, more insistent, and with a sudden jolt, the bathroom door slammed shut behind them. Sarah reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, but it wouldn't budge. The room was suffocating now, the air so thick it felt like she was breathing through water. The whispering grew louder, filling her head, drowning out every other sound. She called out to Emma, her voice hoarse with panic, but there was no response. The mirror began to rattle on the wall, vibrating with a force that seemed impossible. And then, with a deafening crack, the glass shattered, sending shards flying across the room. Sarah threw her arms up to protect her face, but when she looked back at the wall, the mirror was intact. The glass was whole, unbroken, but now it was completely black, like a void stretching into eternity. In the darkness of the mirror, Sarah saw something move. A hand, pale, skeletal, slowly reaching toward her. She backed away, her breath quickening, but the hand kept coming, closer and closer, until it pressed against the surface of the glass. And then, with a sickening scrape, it began to push through. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, her eyes wide with terror. But the door behind her still wouldn't open. Emma was gone now, her body was still there, standing frozen in front of the mirror, but her eyes, they were different. Dark, empty, like the life had been drained from them. She turned slowly towards Sarah, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Sarah backed up against the door, her hands scrambling for the handle, but it was useless. The creature stepped closer, its bony fingers reaching for her, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a hunger that sent shivers down her spine. Time seemed to slow as the creature loomed over her, its breath cold and foul against her skin. And then, with a sudden jolt, the door behind her flew open, sending her tumbling into the hallway. She scrambled to her feet, her heart racing, and ran down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The darkness seemed to follow her, wrapping around her like a living thing. Every mirror she passed showed the same twisted reflection: Emma's empty eyes, the creature's skeletal grin, watching her, waiting. She burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting her like a wall, but the relief was short-lived. The house, dark and looming behind her, seemed to pulse with malevolence, as though it were alive, feeding off her fear. She looked around frantically, searching for some sign of Emma, but the yard was empty, the street deserted. And then, in the reflection of the rain-soaked street, she saw it. Emma's face, pale and lifeless, smiling up at her from the puddles. The whispers began again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she realized what it meant. Bloody Mary wasn't just a story, she was real, and she was coming for her. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey into the legend of Bloody Mary and want more spine-chilling stories, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with your friends who love a good scare. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you never miss a thrilling update. And if you're feeling brave, leave a comment below. Would you ever dare summon Bloody Mary?